My clock says 12:30 Eastern time, which hopefully means on Senator Jacques says 11:30 Central time. And I would like to welcome everyone to the Midwestern Legislative Conference, Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus webinar. I am Carolyn Orr, and I work as the liaison for the task force. And this webinar will be hosted by the caucus's Nutrient Management Task Force. Since we are all experts at Zooming by now, I just want to put this reminder up here. The recording will be available later today, both on the CSG website and the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative website. We will make sure you get an email reminding you of these after the conclusion of the webinar. We do encourage active participation in this webinar. You can raise your hand as a participant. You can type a question in the chat pane, or just unmute yourself and ask a question. If you're not asking a question, please keep your computer on mute to minimize background noise so that Representative Paula Hicks Hudson and my dogs don't take over the webinar. With that, I'm very pleased to be able to turn this over to our Task Force Chair, Senator Andre Jacques.
Thank you, Carolyn. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on which time zone you're joining us from. On behalf of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus Chair, Illinois Representative Robin Gable, and the Vice Chair, Minnesota Representative Jennifer Schultz, I want to remind everyone that this is the first in a series of webinars to replace the in-person annual meeting that was canceled in January. There are 3 additional webinars coming up, one focusing on recent federal and state policy changes on Friday, March 4th, followed by a look at climate resiliency for our coastal communities on Friday, March 11th, and then followed by Friday, March 18th for our first discussion of plastics in the Great Lakes. Just go to our website listed on this slide to register. And now, without further delay, we will turn to the subject of today's webinar, the value and importance of wetlands. Wetlands is a topic we have not spent much time on in the GLLC, but they are priceless for their role in cleaning and recharging water, our primary interest. And I think it's also important that we keep in mind their other roles as an additional way of convincing hesitant colleagues and others of their value. Roles like reducing flood risk, providing fish and wildlife habitat, and even commercial fishery benefits and recreational opportunities. And I am very pleased to introduce to you Mark Dilley, co-owner of Mad Scientist Associates. What a great name that is. President of the Ohio Wetlands Association and a faculty member at Ohio State University. Mark has 30 years of experience as a field biologist, ecologist, and wetland scientist, and he's going to be talking with us today about the broad role of wetlands. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Andre. Appreciate it. Very happy to be here today. And I especially want to thank Brooke, who extended an invite. I don't know if Brooke has joined us, but it's an exciting and fun opportunity for me to talk to you all today. Let's see here. I'll try to get my screen share going. Is that looking okay to everybody? All right. Let's see here. Got to move some windows out of the way here. So today I'm very happy to speak to you about wetlands and their value. And I believe that my private sector consulting, nonprofit, and academic experiences have given me a broad base of perspectives to share, from the scientific and practical to the personal. My hope is to inspire you, our political leaders, to advocate for wetland preservation and restoration, and arm you with useful information and insights in making your own case for wetlands. So I'd like to begin with a look back at our historic views and treatments of wetlands. This quote, which I'll let you read as I'm talking, is by a famous botanist, Carl Linnaeus. The guy loved plants, and wetlands are home to a lot of fascinating ones. And yet here he is trash talking wetlands and equating muskegs, which is a type of peatland wetland, to the river that you cross if you're headed to hell. Needless to say, wetlands have had some public relations challenges. As a result of these perceptions and the need for resources, especially land, many of our wetlands have been modified. And drainage is one of the most prevalent alterations that we tend to see. And we're going to talk about, whoop, I skipped past my slide there. We're going to talk about that a little bit. In the early days, when settlers were actively clearing forests, logs were abundant and were actually used to line trenches that were dug through these wet fields to aid in subsurface drainage. An interesting practice, the logs would form a void below ground that would allow water to travel from the soil above. And then when it hit the trench, the void between the logs, it could travel off-site to the nearest stream expeditiously. Ditches were also a common practice for getting water off the land. Soon, the logs and other structures that were used were replaced by clay tile, and the modern day equivalent is perforated plastic pipe. Here you see a large tiling machine with pipe being laid in the ground to artificially drain wetland soils. If you're not aware, there are three parameters that must exist in order for an area to be characterized as a wetland. And these are a dominance of hydrophytic or wetland vegetation. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has lists of plant species organized based on their tolerance for wet conditions. And so an obligate wetland plant is one that you can really only find in a wetland. Most people would think of things like cattails and water lilies. And then we have a lengthy list of species that are facultative wetland species that tend to occur in wetlands. And those must be present in an area for it to be identified as wetland. Those areas also have to contain hydric soils. Wetlands under saturated conditions, or soils under saturated conditions, develop what's called a low chroma, a color in the soil related to the chemistry of oxygen deprived soils. And then the formation of these redoxomorphic features or mottles that are characteristic of these soils. And then finally, these areas would have to have some evidence of wetland hydrology in the form of inundation, saturation, or other indicators that the area gets a fair amount of water during the year. This can be things like drift lines along rivers where branches and things have accumulated in the floodplain. You can tell how high the waters had come, silt deposition, etc. So where areas of the land meet these three parameters, they're considered wetland. What unmakes a wetland is our activities to modify the landscape, such as drainage. And when we install drainage, we of course remove the water from the site, from that ecosystem. The vegetation disappears because the water is no longer there to support hydrophytic vegetation, and oftentimes it's being replaced with commercial agricultural crops. But the hydric soils can persist for quite some time and still be identified. And I want to mention that because it's an important piece to understand when we talk later about restoration of wetlands. So wetland conversion has been a very common fate for wetlands across the Midwest. You can see this very linear trend from 1890 to 1990, representing the millions of hectares of farmland being drained in the United States. And in a map representation, this is sort of what the conversion looks like. And you can kind of see where the most concentrated areas of drainage have occurred historically, and it's within the Mississippi River Basin. So all of our farms in the Midwest that drain towards the Gulf Coast are kind of fast tracking that agricultural drainage water down the Mississippi. And the influx of excess nutrients to the coast have resulted in this zone of hypoxia, which the nutrients sort of hyper feed the algae. Algae grows prolifically and then dies and decays. And the aerobic or oxygen consuming microbes that break that material down actually create an oxygen free zone that is essentially worthless for shrimp trawlers and other folks that rely on fisheries for their livelihood. It just becomes devoid of life during these periods of hypoxia. So it's a big issue, and you know, much of our Midwest communities are responsible for what's going on down at the Gulf because of this agricultural drainage. So there's a zoomed in view of 1 year's hypoxic zone spanning from Louisiana over to Texas. As a result of these extensive landscape modifications, especially associated with agricultural drainage, we've lost over half of our wetlands in the US, and that does not include Alaska, which still has a lot of wetlands. But based on the lower 48 in Hawaii, we've lost over half. Canada has also experienced significant losses in specific regions. And of course, this is not unique to North America. This is a global issue. If we focus on the Great Lakes, the percent losses are even greater than the national averages, and this is causing increased pressure on the healthy functioning of our watersheds, as well as creating challenges and threats to our communities. This wetland loss circumvents normal, and that is as nature would have it, watershed functions, and this results in many documented and predictable problems. All this runoff has to go somewhere. It ends up in our lakes, and we get issues with harmful algal blooms as a prime example of the repercussions of wetland loss. The Toledo water plant shut down in 2014 because the cyanotoxin in the water from the cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae, was so high that they couldn't safely treat it for human consumption. This is essentially the Great Lakes analogy to the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So there are many problems associated with wetland losses, and this is not a comprehensive list, but it gives you some idea of the repercussions. I'm sure most of you have been touched by a few of these issues in your political careers, but today I want to put a bit more positivity into the ethos. We could all use some of that, right? So the good news is that I feel we have turned a corner in our understanding and appreciation of wetlands, and I am proud to be an ambassador and proponent of these crucial ecosystems. The shift in thinking began in the 1970s with the Clean Water Act, and this led to a national goal in the United States of no net loss, adopted under George H.W. Bush. An international consortium of organizations later built a strong case for wetlands and other ecosystems in 2005 with their Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report, which drew attention to the ecosystem services we all receive from the natural world. Currently, mounting challenges related to flooding and water quality are serving to catalyze efforts to restore our ecosystems for the benefit, sustainability, and resiliency of our communities. So this is a page out of the ecosystem services, or the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report that focuses on ecosystem services and inland wetlands in particular. And the table here indicates the summary of research that was done looking at these different ecosystem services and their level of service to humanity, with larger dots representing more significant levels of service, smaller dots representing lesser services, and question marks indicating not enough data. but it's a nice summary that really makes a case for what wetlands are doing for us. And in most cases, the services associated with wetlands are considered to be in the medium to high range from this in-depth assessment. And keep in mind, these services are rendered for free where we protect and preserve wetlands. So if you remember nothing else from today's presentation, I hope you remember this, that wetlands are always working for us. They're a good investment for a more sustainable future. So let's talk briefly about these ecosystem services. Please note that due to time constraints, I won't talk about every bullet point in the slides, but I'm happy to share my slide set should you want any of these details or talking points. Provisioning services is one category of ecosystem services that varies in significance by culture and region. But suffice it to say that there are a lot of resources that humans rely on that exist thanks to wetlands. The next category is regulating services. These are all related to natural functions of wetlands that moderate our water cycle and carbon cycle. Groundwater recharge is is of great importance to the functioning of watersheds and the health of our streams. It's also critical for rural communities where residents may still rely on wells as their source of water. So I like to share this graph. It represents stream flow following a storm event under two scenarios. The blue line represents a watershed that is intact with wetlands. In this scenario, after a rain, wetlands capture and slowly release water, resulting in a slower climb of water levels and a more sustained base flow. This protects against erosion, protects our communities from flooding, and improves water quality. The red line is typical of many of our streams in urban areas, where hardening of the watershed, this term that's used to describe increased impervious surfaces, rooftops, sidewalks, roadways, etc., and wetland losses force huge volumes of water into our storm sewers and into our streams, where it will erode and degrade the streams. So how can we shift back to a state of improved watershed function? To reacquire these regulating services and return to a condition more like scenario one, we need to flatten the curve. Preserving and restoring wetlands, intercepting and decommissioning drain tiles where possible, and reducing impervious surfaces will help us get there. Keep double clicking somehow. So having functional floodplains and wetlands helps to dissipate the energy of streams. It reduces erosion, really takes the pressure off of our waterways. So that's an important regulating function, as is flood control. Wetlands are sort of nature's stormwater ponds. They're the areas where water will collect and then slowly release rather than running into the nearest stream or lake. And there's a lot of associated benefits with having wetlands to protect communities. Another big one that we're very laser focused on in Ohio right now is water quality improvement. Wetlands are very effective at absorbing nutrients. Every wetland is a little different in terms of its efficiency, but studies have shown that reductions can be quite significant for phosphorus and nitrogen, which otherwise find their way into our lakes and reservoirs and can cause these harmful algal blooms. Wetlands also have been shown to reduce a variety of different environmental contaminants that can degrade water quality in receiving streams. Wetlands are also locations on the landscape where carbon naturally accumulates due to high rates of plant growth and slow decomposition rates in the anoxic soils that build in these areas. Methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas, can be generated in wetlands, but studies have shown that wetlands tend to have an overall net benefit in moderating atmospheric carbon. My favorite ecosystem service, and I suspect this is true for many of you and your constituents, is their value as habitat. One of my favorite hobbies is nature photography, and I'd like to briefly share some wildlife photos and talk a little bit about wetlands' importance in terms of maintaining biological diversity. So this is an American toad, very proudly standing atop some sugar maple leaves in one of our local nature preserves. These animals rely on wetlands for breeding in the spring, and they tend to favor wetlands that we refer to as vernal pools, which are seasonally inundated and therefore lack fish that would feed on the eggs and tadpoles. This next photo, and a shameless plug for our company, has a wood frog, which is a obligate vernal pool forested wetland species. Very beautiful frog that many wouldn't be familiar with unless they spend time in forested wetlands, but they're a handsome animal. This is a smallmouth salamander. Our native salamanders, the mole salamanders, use these seasonal wetlands that we call vernal pools for their breeding. So this one is situated with its eggs in one of these breeding pools. And we get the big, bad, and ugly critters in wetlands too. I happen to think this is a pretty cool animal, but this is a very large snapping turtle. Not everybody's jam necessarily, but we like seeing these beasts. This was also at a local nature preserve. We have some interesting insects. This is called a swamp darner. It's, I think, the largest dragonfly that we have in the state of Ohio, and this one's actually laying its eggs on a saturated log within a forested wetland area. Very cool insect. We have lots of shorebirds, predatory birds like the green heron here. Plenty of waterfowl that use our wetlands. This is a mama mallard hen and its young. And we have some interesting novelties that we encounter from time to time. This is probably one of my favorite things to ever have crossed in the field. This is a crayfish, commonly referred to as the painted hand mud bug, Cambarus polychromatus, and it can have several different color morphs. This one happened to be just a striking blue. I'd never seen anything like it, and had to talk to a crayfish expert to understand what I had seen, but really neat animal. And it was on one of our wetland restoration sites, showed up shortly after construction, building its little underground tunnels. So really interesting. So in terms of wildlife habitat and that ecosystem service, it's important to note that a lot of our threatened and endangered plants and animals are associated with wetlands at some point during their life cycle. And this is an approximate rundown of those species. A lot of them are on the threatened and endangered species list because of their loss of habitat associated with wetland destruction and drainage. And the final major category of ecosystem services is cultural services. This is all about the human experience in and around wetlands. And these services are at the heart of the personal stories that I'll share later. I also wanted to mention, I don't know if this quite falls under cultural services, but I think the argument could be made that wetlands are often portrayed as job killers. Wetlands and policies to protect wetlands are viewed as job killers. But there is a lot of work going on right now, particularly in our state, and I think it's true of other states as well, that employs folks like me and my team here at Mad Scientist Associates to do site analysis and design and permitting and all of that, so that we're able to put wetlands back on the landscape. So there are jobs that are associated with this this world of wetlands. Simply put, wetlands can be relaxing, fun, and educational places to visit. This is a wetland in our hometown, one of our parks that we helped design, and I'm going to be talking to you about that in more detail very soon. So I want to mention a little bit about efforts to expand and improve wetland resources. And I want to mention that wetland preservation and protection is really our first and best option. Let's try to, as much as is practicable, protect the wetlands that already exist. I'm going to be leaving the policy topics to Aaron, but I did want to give a brief overview of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers mitigation hierarchy. So when a new project is being considered, there are development plans in the works where a wetland may be on a property. The Army Corps advocates that we first look to avoid impacts. If you can develop a design that stays out of the wetland area, maybe preserve some buffer for that wetland, that's the ideal scenario. Where you can't completely avoid impacts to the wetland, the Army Corps encourages us to minimize those impacts so that we're preserving as much wetland as we can. And then when wetlands are impacted, then we're obliged to provide compensatory mitigation, which means create wetland elsewhere to offset your impacts to achieve that national goal of no net loss. So when it comes to mitigating wetland impacts and putting wetlands back on the landscape, restoration is the gold standard in doing so. So I mentioned earlier that when hydric soils are artificially drained, that they still persist as hydric soils. And if the site is modified, if the artificial drainage is removed, they can actually recover quite nicely as wetlands. Those drained hydric soils are in logical locations in terms of the landscape. The restoration process is more reliable since a wetland once existed in the footprint of that area. They may contain a viable seed bank, which means that they're actually wetland seeds kind of residing in the soil. And if hydrology is restored, the wetland may recover in part on its own through the germination of seeds within the seed bank. And earthwork can oftentimes be minimal in these settings where the drain tiles are the major factor in eliminating the wetland hydrology. Simply removing them can restore that hydrology without having to move a lot of dirt. Here's an example in my region of some very agriculturally drained lands. In this aerial image with the crops off, during the wet season, you can see the drainage network, those light lines passing every which way through that field to a central drainage swale, which is a straightened channelized stream that is now treated as a grass waterway, represents just a huge wetland restoration opportunity. And these are the kinds of things that we look for when we have opportunities to put wetlands back on the landscape. This would be an ideal circumstance because of the existence of those hydric soils. So we are now in what is being referred to as the generation restoration. The World Economic Forum and the Society for Ecological Restoration have put information out there referring to young people and ecopreneurs as generation restoration. And there's a lot of activity going on right now in identifying opportunities to put wetlands back on the landscape, particularly in low performing agricultural areas where the flood losses are persistent. Oftentimes those areas represent very good opportunities for restoration. In Ohio, I'm really proud of my home state for initiating this H2 Ohio program that is very focused on large-scale restoration for the benefit of the public and our lakes and rivers. The major emphasis within this program has been on improving the quality of Lake Erie and reducing the frequency and severity of harmful algal blooms. But the program is now being extended statewide, so there's lots of opportunities outside of the Lake Erie watershed, but all across the state to do some good wetland restoration work. So I want to give you a sort of start to finish example of what restoration can look like, and then highlight some personal stories related to the cultural services that wetlands can provide. This is a project in my hometown. It's literally 2 miles from my office, and it's at the Highlands Park, and we refer to this as our Wetlands Enhancement and Expansion Project, also known as our Extreme Marsh Makeover, and you'll see why in a minute. The background on this project is that the land we were working with was farmed in the 1950s. And I have an aerial I'll show you in just a moment. You can see the site has absolutely no natural vegetation on it. The city of Westerville acquired the park in acquired the site for a park in the 1970s. The drainage system started to fail, and the area became too wet to mow. There was a lot of development in the community, and sediment kind of built up in this wetland area, and it filled in with an invasive species of cattail, narrowleaf cattail and hybrid cattail kind of dominated the wetland. The city later decided that they wanted to redo the park. It included a community swimming pool, and they were going to change some things up. And the powers that be within the city and Parks and Rec Department decided that they wanted to incorporate the wetland as a central feature for the park. And I'm very grateful they did. We worked with the city to receive a grant from Ohio EPA. Those funds originate with the US EPA and then are funneled through the state EPAs, but we were able to get funding to help pay for the design and construction of this site. And the construction and planting were completed during 2012, 2013. So this is what our site looked like in 1954. And these dark areas are, as I like to refer to them, the ghosts of wetlands past. And this was the best area, the most hydric soil that existed on the site. And you can see it clearly in the aerials. By 2004, it was a city park. The area that sort of reformed is this kind of shaggy appearing area that extends down through the site. And it was essentially 100% cattail and nothing else. Didn't have a lot of habitat value. People weren't crazy about the appearance of it. Probably provided some good water quality function, but very little else. So we were able to come up with a design that improved on the system, added a little bit more heterogeneity to the water depths and habitats that were available. We actually incorporated some wetland features in what had been conventional storm detention ponds. They were modified to create additional wetland space. And by 2014, we showed up on Google Earth, which was exciting. It's always fun to see your projects on Google Earth when they get another round of aerial photographs up. So when we launched into this, we did a lot of public education. We wanted the community to understand that there was going to be a little disruption as we were working through this process, but also provide them with some assurances that in a fairly short time period, you would never guess that we were running through this area with heavy equipment. We also talked to the community about kind of a before and after snapshot of what benefits we anticipated. How is the biological diversity of the site going to improve? What are we going to have in terms of plant community types, and what are the water quality benefits? We talked about the flow length of water from one storm pipe, so one storm sewer pipe to the exit at the other end, and how we were extending that flow length, which increased residence time, which helps to improve water quality. And also, told them that we were going to be expanding the wetland footprint from about 2 acres to almost 3 acres. And that's just a graphical representation of the improvements we anticipated. So this is the site as the cattails were just being kind of flattened out by the contractor. This would be a typical view from the park entry drive across the wetland. You were pretty much staring into 10-foot tall cattail. We opened that area up with the help of our excavation team, and worked around some large bald cypress trees, which were the only additional species that was really prevalent at the site. Somebody within the Parks Department several decades prior had planted some bald cypress, and they did quite well. And we decided we really needed to make sure that those were maintained because they were such nice and appropriate wetland trees. We worked with our community to do a lot of the plantings. This was a very hands-on volunteer activity. This is a group of students from our local college, Otterbein College, that came out. Funny story there was, as we were looking at the 20,000 plants that we needed to put in the ground, I sort of joked with my staff about how we maybe should have made arrangements with the prison system to see if we could get some prison help to do the work. And the Otterbein volunteer bus showed up just minutes later, and everybody was wearing orange, which was the theme for that year's Community Plunge Day. So we kind of got a kick out of that. Lots of families came out to help put these plants in the ground. I think it's a really great thing if you're working restoration in urban areas, and you can call on citizen support, because the folks that come out to get involved with these plantings are the future stewards of the site. They're the folks that really care how it turns out. They're going to let you know if something's going wrong. It gives them a sense of contributing to the greater good. And this is the result of all those efforts. Just a beautiful wetland. It's a wonderful place to explore and walk around. The community has really embraced it. And we hear nothing but good things. I think there was a little apprehension when we first pitched the idea, because there's grave misunderstandings about what wetlands are and what benefits they offer. But I think that our community here in Westerville has really come to appreciate the Highlands wetlands. It's a great area for plants that are beneficial to pollinators and butterflies as well. And that's a big concern in a lot of our communities and across the globe, that we're losing pollinators. So the park offers lots of pollinator resources, which helps the big picture. And then we do a fair amount of public education through our signage around the park. I'm particularly fond of this sign, which actually took a photograph of the wetland, so that as you're standing and looking at the sign, you actually see the same view with the building in the background here, and a cutaway view of the different species that you may encounter when you're visiting the park. And another thing we do in Westerville that I think is very beneficial and perhaps unique is that in May, which is National Wetlands Month, we hold a Westerville Wetland Workshop, and we set up a variety of stations around within the park, encourage families to come out and explore and learn about wetlands. This is our soil scientist at the time, Daniel, who was describing hydric soils to some of the participants. And we, with this project, discovered fairly early on that the amphibian diversity at the site just exploded. Within the first couple of years, we realized that we had documented 2 species of toads and 5 species of frogs. And we went to the city and said, what would you think about doing a public program that we're going to call Frog Friday to encourage people to come out and explore with us to see the site's diversity of frogs. And in the time that we're together, we can also give them a healthy dose of wetland education. And the city decided that that was something that they wanted to do. And they now pay us to do programming at the park. And we have a lot of fun with this. I love this picture of this young man looking at a toad wearing his frog vest and hood. Definitely one of my favorite photos from a Frog Friday. And then we had these tough youngsters who managed to catch the biggest bullfrog in the wetland. So the community really has a lot of enjoyment and positive associations with this site. In addition, we've done some water quality studies and found that the wetlands are effective at reducing nitrates and phosphorus, which is encouraging. That's exactly what we want to happen. Looking at water in this stormwater driven system flowing through and into a tributary to Allen Creek within our watershed, and knowing that it's being improved is a source of pride for our community. Now I want to tell you a few personal stories. This next set of slides is from a presentation that my team put together for the Ohio Parks and Recreation Association conference a few years back. But I liked the idea of bringing wetlands to your community and bringing your community to wetlands. So that's how we came up with our title. I want to first tell this story about birding and photography. So the park at Highlands Park that I just described is kind of a hot spot locally for seeing birds. We actually had someone observe a bald eagle at the site. Even though it's just a small 3-acre wetland, it really attracts a lot of interesting birds and waterfowl. We regularly have red-winged blackbirds nesting at the site. So there's a nest with hatchlings there. Beautiful sunsets at this site. Just love to get out and take photos. And there's a local photographer that I ran into named Bill Baird, who I struck up a conversation with. And I told Bill that, what our role was in the wetland restoration. And Bill told me that his favorite thing to photograph was wading birds. And he had a tri-county route that he would drive. And he had one site that he would go to where he would reliably see this bird, the great egret, another site where he would see the great blue heron, and yet another site where he would reliably see green herons. And he was coming home from driving this like 60-mile route, taking his photographs, wasn't particularly familiar with our project, but decided that he wanted to see what it was all about. And on the day that he stopped, he got out of his car and looked up and realized from his vantage point that he could see a great egret, a great blue heron, and a green heron at this park. And he's been coming ever since and sharing photos, and actually stopped by our office unannounced one day to give us a framed photograph of one of his great blue heron photos, which is a special memento. And obviously an indication of how these ecosystems can touch a community. Another example that I've titled Artistic Inspiration happened one day when I just happened to drop by the site and notice a large group of people at one end of the parking lot. And I walked down, and this was the scene that greeted me. The Columbus Plein Air Society was out taking inspiration from this wetland and painting it. And not knowing what I was getting myself into, I thought this is a really neat thing that's going on here. I should maybe talk to painters about whether I could purchase a painting. And when I asked that question, about 30 people handed me their business cards. I ended up buying this painting the gentleman that painted it, this watercolor, just ripped it off the easel, gave me his business card and asked me to mail him a $100 check. I went out and spent twice that much to get the silly thing framed, but it's another nice keepsake reminding us of the importance of the work that we do in restoring wetlands, and it hangs in our office.
Mark, I think we need to move on to Aaron.
Okay.
If you could wrap up.
Sure. If I can take 1 minute, I'll just show you quickly a little bit about Frog Friday here. It has become a very popular program. We've seen upwards of 200 people coming out, and it's a great way to educate the public about the value of wetlands. So that's my pitch.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate all the information, the level of detail there. I think for time purposes, we will hopefully still have some time for discussion after Aaron's presentation, but I think we might just go directly at this point to discussion from my home state of Wisconsin with Aaron O'Brien. Aaron is the Policy Programs Director for the Wisconsin Wetlands Association. The association is dedicated to the protection, restoration, and enjoyment of wetlands and associated ecosystems through science-based programs, education, and advocacy. Aaron focuses on strengthening state laws and regulations governing wetland management. She has a master's degree in land resources from my alma mater, UW-Madison. Had the pleasure of working with her on legislation in the past, and just want to thank Aaron for joining us this morning. Welcome, Aaron. Or
thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Senator Jacques. Let's see, I need permission to share my screen if possible. I think we've still got Mark sharing maybe, or.
Got cleared up.
It should be, you should have it.
There we go. Here we go. Thank you. Let me just grab my slides up. And here we go. Everyone see that okay?
Go right ahead.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Senator Jacques, for the introduction, as well as for inviting me to participate in this forum. I'll try to move quickly so we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. A little bit about Wisconsin Wetlands Association. We're a statewide nonprofit organization. Our work is science-based and nonpartisan. We have statewide members. We're also supported by private and government grants. And our approach is to help people and communities see wetlands as solutions to our water issues. And we've been doing this a long time, founded in 1969, so just celebrated our 50th anniversary a couple years ago. I'm going to provide a couple of definitions here because you'll hear me use these terms a lot in the talk. The first is hydrologic assessment. And what I mean when I say that is an interdisciplinary watershed scale look at how and where water used to move across the landscape, its current conditions, so what's changed and to what effect, and also what can be restored or improved to help address specific water challenges. And the specific part is really important because we want to be clear on what we're restoring to and what we're restoring for. Hang on a second, I apologize. I've got my my menu bar right in the middle of my screen, and it's, there we go. Okay, so hydrologic restoration are practices designed to the extent possible in our now developed landscapes to return wetland, stream, and floodplain hydrology to a natural and self-regulating condition in order to achieve the many goals that Mark already went through so well, but most importantly, slowing the flow of runoff and making our aquatic systems more resilient. I'm having trouble advancing my slides. There we go. When we talk about hydrology-focused restoration, we really need to be talking about watersheds. I know you're all familiar with the concepts, but the reason, of course, is that all waters are connected and water flows downhill. So when we have a healthy watershed and healthy hydrologic systems, we're going to have a variety of wetland types across the landscape doing a variety of different things for us, including, excuse me, abundant upper watershed wetlands. These might be areas where groundwater is expressing onto the land, discharging to the land through springs and seeps, or a lot of these geographically isolated wetlands, which are depressional areas that are collecting rain and snow melt, storing it and letting it soak into the ground. We're also going to have streams that are well connected to their wetland floodplains. and that meander, right? So streams are not meant to be straight. And we'll have intact hydrologic processes. So all these things we've already talked about: storage, infiltration, dynamic water levels and flows, and material transport. Rivers are designed to move not just water, but sediment. And I'll use this stream functions pyramid to explain a little bit about how this all comes together and why, when we're thinking about water quality, as well as any other objectives we might be restoring for, we need to be thinking about hydrology. What you see here is that the bottom of the pyramid, represents the processes that rivers and healthy wetlands provide for us. So we're looking at the hydrology, the hydraulics, the geomorphology, all fancy words for explaining where the water is, how it moves, and what comes along with it. And when these processes are healthy and in good shape, the response is that the system has what it needs to have the good water quality and the good habitat and the good critters, et cetera. So we're really thinking about processes and then responses to those processes. So when hydrology is degraded, our landscapes lose the capacity to manage water. And Mark talked a lot about this, but I'll give you a few of my own examples. Loss of upstream wetland storage. So where the storage is lost makes a difference. Obviously, we've talked about drainage ditches and tiles, and this can be in either urban or rural settings, though we think about it a lot in agricultural landscapes. But there's other ways that we're losing wetland storage from the landscape because of erosion and historic land use practices that make runoff cut through wetlands, forming gullies or head cuts. And you can see in this picture on the right an example of a wetland that's really hemorrhaging water and soil and sending all of that material downstream. And of course, the combined effect of the man-made and the natural processes of drainage is downstream flooding and infrastructure damage, particularly culverts and road washouts. And of course, you can see from the pictures, it's a muddy mess, and this is affecting our water quality as well. Other examples, stream channelization. Here's an aerial image of that really nicely shows both what the original stream channel used to look like, meandering and providing for slow moving water, interacting well with its adjacent floodplain, versus a stream that's been straightened and moved to one side. We see other ways that streams are disconnected from their wetland floodplains through either incision. This is an erosive process that's cutting down the bed of the stream, so lowering it, or deposition, where materials coming off the landscape and burying floodplain soils. In some cases, like this picture, it even has a bit of both. And again, in these situations, regardless of why it happened, the creeks are acting like drains, and it's accelerating erosion and sediment and sending all of that material downstream. And of course, the fish and wildlife aren't all that happy with the situation either. So from a process standpoint, again, here we're talking about loss of wetland and floodplain storage and connectivity results in erosion, catastrophic erosion in some cases, and this leads to the transport of water, sediment, and nutrients downstream. Muddy rivers connect to our Great Lakes, and we have problems. So I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about some traditional nutrient management approaches, or my perception of them in relation to what we get when we take a hydrology focused approach. So a lot of the practices that we invest heavily in for nutrient management, whether it's regulations or technologies or various agricultural best management practices, are designed to prevent, reduce, or treat the pollution itself. When we change our approach and look at the hydrology and restoring wetland, stream, and floodplain functions, we're looking at repairing the processes needed to control the runoff itself. So another way of thinking about this is site-specific practices that address symptoms versus system-level improvements that can address root causes. So we like to say in our office, wetlands alone won't fix the problems, but we can't fix these problems without wetlands. Now, I don't mean to suggest in any way that all of these other things we're doing aren't effective and important, because they are. But what I am saying is that we need really a suite of approaches that combine these more traditional nutrient management practices with some of these hydrologic restoration approaches. Otherwise, we're we're asking a lot of the interventions that we're paying for. And by that, I mean, we can do all the buffers or cover crops in the world, but if the underlying or overlying hydrology is still degraded and causing uncontrolled runoff, we're going to overwhelm those systems. And I have a good example of what that can look like from research that came out of Minnesota on wetlands and nitrates. They found that wetland complexes can be 5 times better at reducing nitrates than the best land-based nitrogen mitigation strategies, so cover crops and more traditional land retirement. I won't get too much into the mechanics of this. I'm not a biogeochemist, but essentially, as Mark relayed, wetland soils have high organic matter because the plants don't decompose in wet environments. And this invites bacteria that feed on that carbon that are also really good at converting harmful nitrates to nitrogen gas. So it's really elegant approach to denitrification. What's important to understand, though, is that it works best when we have well-connected wetlands across the landscape. So we can measure what we get from any single wetland, but the research is showing that if we have wetlands connected to our tributaries and to our streams and their floodplains, we're going to have less nitrates in our surface waters. So the question for all of you is, how well do your state or provincial policies and programs support this type of watershed scale hydrologic assessment and restoration? Well, we had the opportunity with support from an EPA Wetland Program Development Grant to take a look at that in Wisconsin. This was a collaboration between us, our Department of Agriculture, and our Department of Natural Resources. And the answer was not very well. We did not have a lot of structural supports for wetland and stream restoration focused on hydrology. And there were a lot of barriers from we don't have the right data or decision support tools. Our engineers and technical service providers aren't well trained in these approaches. And the funding streams that are supporting water quality work and other interventions on flooding, et cetera, are really focused on site-specific projects or short-term projects. And with watershed scale work, you really need to be looking at landscape processes and implementing practices across the landscape. So I want to wrap up with some policy recommendations to help you all think about how you might elevate hydrologic restoration approaches in the implementation of your state programs. And I'll use the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus's model policies to reduce nutrient pollution in the Great Lakes region as my frame. So reminding you all of your own priorities, your model policy number 1, engaging with and incentivizing agricultural producers to adopt best management practices for managing nutrients. Well, a recommendation I have is to make sure that the programs you have, the incentive programs you have, ensure that wetland practices are eligible for those funds. In Wisconsin, they haven't really been, and it's something we're now working on in collaboration with our Department of Agriculture with the help of another wetland program development grant from the EPA to examine opportunities in a rulemaking that's currently pending. So something important to look at. That grant also provides us with some support to train agricultural engineers and other consultants to both recognize the signs of degraded hydrology and design and engineer practices to reestablish it. Another opportunity or thing to look at is how well permitting regulatory requirements are supporting or discouraging this kind of hydrologic restoration. In Wisconsin, we were finding that there were a lot of barriers to doing this kind of work in our regulatory processes. So we collaborated with our legislature and they passed 2021 Wisconsin Act 77, requiring our Department of Natural Resources to develop a general permit for hydrologic restoration that would support a variety of practices designed to restore hydrologic conditions, connections, and functions. The permit is under development right now, so it's not yet in place, but we know from other program evaluations that the availability of general permits can really drive the kinds of practices that landowners and land managers are willing to invest in. If it's cheaper and easier to do, it will be done. And so that's the objective of this policy. Your all's recommendation number 2, engage in educational and outreach activities to share information on the causes and impacts of nutrient pollution and the role each person can play in reducing the problem. our recommendation and things that we've been working on in Wisconsin is to really try to invest in watershed scale hydrologic assessments. These are projects that are interdisciplinary and work to help communities both identify where the degraded hydrology is and what the priority sites for restoration might be based on their goals, whether it's nutrient management or flood reduction or habitat. We've been lucky to be part of a project in central Wisconsin that benefited from a state budget appropriation for the Little Plover River watershed. And then we've also benefited from some legislative investments in funding for demonstration of hydrologic restoration practices. And this is important if these kinds of approaches aren't yet well implemented in your state. They certainly haven't been in Wisconsin. Traditionally, we've seen more wetland restoration for wildlife benefits and less focused on hydrologic restoration. And so designing some of these projects and having sites where we can bring people out and talk to them and teach them and monitor and share results has been really important and really instructive. And then finally, I'd encourage more research to quantify the benefits of this kind of restoration, particularly for nitrate reduction, but also to demonstrate that it can be cost effective and to quantify the hydrologic or water quality measurable outcomes from these kinds of projects. We know it works because the science tells us it does, but it seems that state-specific or province-specific projects that sort of prove it in a local landscape really help with the educational piece. Finally, your priority was to include the installation of green infrastructure among the tools used to improve the management of nutrients. I would encourage consideration of natural infrastructure as well. The distinction I make is that green infrastructure tends to be urban focused, site-specific, and sometimes more engineered and designed gray practices. Whereas natural infrastructure is really letting the wetland or the waterway do some of the work. And what we want to look at is enabling our utilities and our local governments to invest in upstream solutions to solve downstream problems. And also prioritizing the reestablishment of the healthy hydrologic processes, so not just looking at wetlands and streams for habitat. I'll wrap up here with my recap of the benefits of this kind of watershed scale hydrologic assessment and restoration approach. The first thing is that there's really no one size fits all problem. We saw that from both my examples and Mark's. And there's no one size fits all solution. We can't put all our eggs in one basket. And this kind of restoration allows us to work in different parts of the watershed with different systems. It can be low cost and low tech and highly effective. It enables multi-objective work, and this is really important because we have tight budgets, and so the benefit of restoring hydrology, whether you're doing it for water quality or something else, is that you always get water quality and habitat and flood resilience. So we can really stretch our dollars and have a more coordinated approach to managing our water systems. The work can be voluntary, so it gets us away from regulatory wrangling. It can be strategic and targeted, and it can be done in ways that are compatible with other current land uses, whether that's agriculture or urban environments. And this is really important for attracting private landowners and local government engagement. So that is all I have, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Let's see.
Very good. Thank you, Erin.
You're welcome.
Appreciate that. I do have a question, but I think first we'll start with, and I don't see any questions in the chat right now, but I believe Representative Paula Hicks Hudson from Ohio was going to have our first question. And I do want to remind all of our participants that the slides are in PDFs that are in the chat. So certainly you can get them from the GLLC afterwards as well, but feel free to download those from the chat window. And with that, we'll turn to Representative Hicks Hudson.
Well, thank you, Senator. I really don't have any questions, but I almost kind of want to counterpoint what Erin just talked about and talk about what we're doing in Ohio as it relates to H2 Ohio in terms of wetland restoration. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources is the agency that is charged with, under the H2 Ohio legislation, to establish a comprehensive water quality initiative. That initiative not only included the Department of Natural Resources, but the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Agriculture. ODNR's primary role is to create, restore, and enhance wetlands across Ohio. And it started in 2019 in the Western Lake Erie Basin, which is home to the Maumee River and that watershed. The overall goal of the H2 Ohio and ODNR is to mitigate the adverse effect of runoff nutrient loading into Ohio waterways, and then particularly to address the harmful algal blooms that continue to plague Lake Erie, as well as other bodies of water throughout the state of Ohio. I won't go into, all the things that talked about, but one of the things that was so important for us in Ohio is to deal with having wetlands working and being installed or enhanced on private property with farmland and things like that. So the agency administers a grant program offering funding to private landowners, municipalities, and nonprofits for wetland restoration. These projects can include restoration and enhancement of wetlands, coastal marshes, and floodplain reconnection, capturing stormwater, as well as stream bank improvements. There really is no cost for the share of the private person, because the funds are coming from the H2 Ohio allocations. There's also H2 Ohio Water Quality Incentive Program, and that is offered in combination with the Lake Erie Conservation Reserve Program. And that offers a one-time payment of $2,000 per acre for new wetlands and forest riparian buffers in the Lake Erie watershed. And one of the things that I think is important, based upon what Aaron just said, is that ODNR also has partnered with the Lake Erie and Aquatic Research Network, which is a group of field stations, scientific laboratories, and diverse researchers within Ohio to promote collaborative research, education, and networking to address the challenges and opportunities facing Ohio's freshwater resources. And I've got some facts and figures that so far H2 Ohio has had 83 wetland projects. We've spent $89.6 million to support wetland implementation. $4.3 million has been allocated to establish independent project monitoring. 43 nonprofit conservation partners are engaged with us in this effort. There's so far 98,681 acres of watershed filtered by wetland projects, and 141 landowners have been incentivized to establish wetlands and wooded areas, I can't say this very quickly, riparian buffers. 90 threatened endangered species dependent on wetlands. Many will benefit from these additional wetland habitats. We've had 40,000 trees planted to act as wetland buffers. So in Ohio, we have taken that clarion call from the 2014 Do Not Drink advisory in the city of Toledo, and those of us in Northwest Ohio continue to work to support programs like this. And I agree wholeheartedly that we have to deal with this problem in a system-wide approach as well, to site specific. And with that, if you have any questions, we're ready to take them. And thank you for this opportunity to talk about what's happening in Ohio.
Senator Jacques, I think Representative Hood has a question.
Yes, I actually have a question as well. If we could just have a discussion of the wetland mitigation banks. I know in Wisconsin, we've had an issue where there's kind of the payment in lieu of to the state, but we've been having difficulty in actually getting some of those projects going when we have developments where there isn't an ability to avoid some disruption to make sure that we're making some improvements. Aaron, do you have any sort of an update on where we're at with that?
Well, I'm not in the weeds on the accounting of credits available. I know the timelines for wetland mitigation projects can take a very long time because they're governed by both state, excuse me, and federal regulations. And there's a lot of strings attached when you're trying to restore wetlands for mitigation purposes. So, the good news is that there is funding through in-lieu fee programs and wetland mitigation banking to restore wetlands, but they're being restored to offset wetland losses from development. And so a caution I guess I'd share with this group is that we can and should be doing smart projects with our mitigation and making sure we're getting good services out of them and high quality projects. But the kinds of investments that Ohio is making in promoting voluntary restoration is really what we need to get the volume of wetlands back on the landscape to solve these big problems.
The question from Rachel Hood is, a challenge recently shared with me is around funding and staffing maintenance for GI and wetlands. How are Great Lakes states facing this challenge? And that would be, I guess, to Aaron and to Mark.
And to our legislators on the phone.
Yeah, yes.
I'd be happy to start if it's helpful. My personal opinion, and I hope this isn't too provocative, is that the state of Wisconsin has really not invested very well in wetlands. We spend a lot of money and have a lot of staff power treating invasive species or doing shoreline management. And those are good projects and good programs, but they don't get at the structural sort of process-based needs that we need to have healthy aquatic systems. And so I personally would love to see some either additional investments or realignment. I mean, our whole DNR has, I think, 2 people focused on non-regulatory wetland solutions, maybe even just 1. So we're not investing at the levels we need to. But I can't speak to other states. It sounds like Ohio's got their game on.
We've had webinars before focused more on the H2 Ohio program, but certainly it's a very substantial investment. And of course, we have an upcoming webinar that we encourage everybody to take a look at in terms of some of the infrastructure dollars that are coming down from the federal government to hopefully give additional resources for some of our state-based projects, but I certainly go ahead, Representative.
Thank you. If I could just jump in real quickly, because the way that Ohio has approached this whole issue is that you have, as I said, the 3 departments working together. And so while the Department of Natural Resources are working on the wetlands, they are in close partnership with the Department of Agriculture and through our county extension services to really be able to work with the agriculture community on how to talk to them about changing their practices and maybe looking at ways to create more wetlands. That's number 1. Number 2 is the as there are grants and other things available to change land over. We have a very strong in the city of Toledo. I can speak only to them, that if we are having some type of development that has an impact on wetlands, before we can move one project an inch forward, we have to be able to identify how we're going to mitigate and find wetlands someplace else. So that's just the lay of the land in Ohio. And I think it really comes down to elected officials and those that are in seats of power really pushing and supporting those methods that we need, and then really educating all of us about the benefit and the effects if we don't change our actions.
Representative David Abbott from Indiana, if he's still with us, I think he had a story from last legislative session that he wanted to share with the group.
Yeah, thank you, Jacques. Yes, I am still here. Yeah, we've been trying to work through some difficulties we had last session a year ago We've got, of course, affordable housing with builders that we're trying to get costs down, and developers that have been complaining over the years about how this is inhibiting their ability to build in areas where there are wetlands, or maybe there's fennial streams that flood during rain events or snowmelt events. What ended up happening was kind of a controversial bill that was introduced in the Senate. It was House or Senate Bill 389, and what their proposal to do was from the Senate was to eliminate all permitting and mitigation requirements of all wetlands in the state of Indiana, which is about 813,000 acres of isolated wetlands. And I got involved with this along with Representative Slager. We started writing amendments to dial that back because that was just a knee-jerk reaction. I think it was a shot across the bow to get our attention. But what we were trying to do is dial that back so that we would still provide for, let's say in the ag community, we have 3 classes of isolated wetlands, class 1, 2, and 3. 3 would be more or less what you would call a regular cypress trees type of wet environment wetland. 2 or 1 is something that's just maybe 50% man-made, and it's got limited native species in it and aquatic animals, things like that. Number 2 is kind of in between. It's kind of in no man's land. So that's where the problem was, where people were misinterpreting what class of wetland it was, and our Indiana Department of Environmental Management was, I have to say, probably over-regulating some of these areas in an overzealous manner, which created a confrontational situation. So what the bill ended up doing, our amendments were stripped out of the bill, and they still have an exemption now in law of all class 1 wetlands, which not all class 1 wetlands are wet spots in the middle of a field. We were trying to address that disparity there between what really is and is not a wetland. And I think one thing that was really working against us as a state was what's the definition of the different classes of wetlands and what mitigation ratios or in lieu of fee would be applied to each class. So the one amendment that I wrote that did stay in was that we formed a task force with all the involved stakeholders to try to align ourselves more with what the federal U.S. Army Corps of Engineers designate as wetland classes, so that we would have clarity. And that would be one of the things we did with this 14-member task force. But we're also trying to mitigate the cost for the builders and developers and reduce flood, study the flood reduction benefits. And we were working with the soil and water conservation. Different organizations are on this board that represent land surveyors, Department of Environmental Management, a builders association member. So we had from all walks that would be involved from one point of view or another to come to a place where we can work together to protect the wetlands and still allow for responsible growth and building economically, but not be in that conflict mode where we somewhat are now. And as you know, last year the district court in Arizona made a ruling that the navigable waters protection rule was effectively eliminated. That was the Trump era rule that redefined waters of the U.S. Protected by the Clean Water Act. They did away with that. We're now back to the pre-Obama years, where the federal EPA has now taken over control of most of those wetlands. So we're in an area now that's a little uncharted as far as statutorily on how states operate. The main thing is builders now have to go through jurisdictional determination to find out where they are, what kind of a wetlands it is. Do they need a 404 permit or a state permit? And in that process, we have this task force that's trying to unwrap what wetlands are and how we can address those in a very responsible way, working with the people closest to that to that issue. Like I said in this task force. So we're learning. It's something that I think the carrot and the stick is a great example. We're also I am personally working on with some environmental crews doing studies of lakes on nutrient loading. and what we can do in the upstream areas on cover crops, everything we're talking about with H2O. We're trying to apply some of these values into Indiana, and out of that, we're hoping to come up with some funding. That seems to be the main issue. We identify the problem, but we don't have the dollars to implement it. So this, what we're doing now is a more integrated process where we think if we can get these issues at least identified, so we have a plan of action, then we can go for legislative funding of this hopefully next year. So, but that's where we're at.
Thank you so much, Representative. Certainly there's parallels to discussions in other states. I know in Wisconsin, there were some regulatory changes for wetlands. Actually, Aaron and I had worked together on some legislation that dealt with artificial wetlands, kind of trying to make clear that there is that differentiation of not all wetlands have the same functional value. And if you have some cattails spring up because of a puddle that fills in on a website because of some dirt piles or something like that, that's not the same as maybe isolated wetlands that still have an important purpose for wildlife. And anyways, I know we weren't really successful with how exactly we were trying to approach the issue. The artificial wetlands did get wrapped into a different bill, but I know that Wisconsin formed a wetland study council to kind of get out ahead of some of these conflicts. I know some of the actual scientists that are, the assured wetland delineators from our DNR that have been part of some of those discussions as well. But Aaron, maybe if you could even talk a little bit about how you were able to set that up, because that is something that I think, again, the more you have those discussions already happening ahead of the legislative process, it can be helpful in terms of a barrier to kind of rasher decision making.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to. And I think Representative Abbott said it really well when he said that that the regulatory agencies in his state were maybe overreaching a little bit, and it was what was really fueling these conflicts. We experienced that as well, and it's a funny thing to come out of the mouth of a wetland advocate, right? I've been studying and working to preserve and protect and restore wetlands for 20 years, but the development community had legitimate concerns about the ways the programs weren't working, and maybe some of the ways that we were, in service of, well, what do I want to say here? I want to be careful. I think sometimes it's easy to lose sight of the fact, and I'm not actually a fan of classes of wetlands, I should say, because a lower quality wetland can be a good restoration opportunity, but we do have to make common sense decisions, and we do have to recognize that not every single wetland impact is equivalent. And so what happened in Wisconsin is we had a very similar proposal to the one Indiana was experiencing, where it was a deregulation effort, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. Pretty unpleasant and a lot of fairly entrenched positions, but we did see some regulatory refinements, but not really big rollbacks. They were really more just tweaks that sort of addressed some of these places where there was confusion or uncertainty, or maybe over administration of some of the rules. And the artificial wetlands exemption is one of the things that got boiled into it. But the other thing that did happen is that, and it was probably the most positive thing that came out of the bill, in my opinion, was it directed the establishment of a wetland study council that had representatives similar to what I think you now have in Indiana, from both the development and the private consultant community that are very familiar with the regulatory processes, like Mark Dilley's firm, as well as conservation groups like ours, to provide a forum where we're talking about the issues and trying to understand them up front, coming up with policy recommendations. So we're not relying wholly on our legislators who are responding to constituents, but maybe don't know the nuance of the bills and how they were, of the regulations and how they're working and not working. So the idea is that maybe everybody gets a little more of what we need, development isn't, allowed to happen. Agricultural management is allowed to happen, but we're protecting wetlands in smart ways as well. So it's been very positive. It's been in place for several years now. Jennifer Westernhauser, who's on our staff and sitting in on this call, sits in on all those meetings. So I'm sure she could say more if there's specific questions.
Right. Well, seeing as we are getting relatively close to our ending time here, I'm not seeing any additional questions at this point, but I do want to again thank our speakers, Mark Dilley and Aaron O'Brien, for sharing their time and energy with us today and for their ongoing commitment to wetlands and water quality. Also, on behalf of the GLLC Executive Committee, I want to remind everyone to register on the website for upcoming webinars that are going to be held 1, 2, and 3 weeks from today, and to check in on our website. Let us know what policy you're working on. I would like to remind you to please thank our sponsors. You see them up on the screen there, the Joyce Foundation, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, and the Fred A. and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation. We greatly appreciate the support that we receive from all three of these foundations and the recognition that state and provincial legislators are vital stakeholders to engage in the policymaking process. So with that, I just again want to thank you all for taking some time to join us today, and have a fantastic weekend.